Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel. I don't know if you've been here before or not, sorry. My name is Brendan Romero, and today we're going to be talking comparisons between the Panasonic Lumix S5ii, the Sony A7 IV, and Canon R5C. Now, I would have done the R6 Mark II because that's more in the S5II's arena, but I don't own one of those. And for these tests, the R5C will be just fine. Now, this is not a specs versus specs video or even a feature versus feature video. If that's something you're looking for, you won't find it here. This is a performance comparison video. We're going to be looking at autofocus tests, and then we're going to be looking at mostly finished color profiles, as well as some log tests and resolution. Now, on January 27th, we traveled to Unique Photo in Fairfield, New Jersey. And if you don't know, Unique Photo is an amazing camera store. They deal in all the major camera brands. They do tons of rental equipment, whether it be lighting, studio equipment, cameras, lenses, everything. They rent stuff. They rent stuff. You can even trade in your equipment and trade up, and you can even build credits towards future purchases. Now, Unique Photo hosted Panasonic with a first look at the S5ii. Now, keep in mind, this is a pre-production model, so the actual thing may vary. Now, both Unique Photo and Panasonic Lumix allowed us not just to get a first look, but a hands-on experience with the S5ii. And with Unique Photo being into it, and with the Lumix rep Matt Chandler being into it, we were able to put this thing through the ringer. So again, today we're going to look at some results of pinging it against some of its contemporaries, the Sony A7 IV and the Canon R5C. Now, these are my personal cameras. This is what we use for stills, for video production, so we were able to bring them along and do some tests. Now, we started by matching lenses as closely as we possibly could. On the R5C, we have the Canon RF24-70 2.8, and on both the Sony A7 IV and the Lumix S5ii, we put the Sigma 28-70 2.8. Now, this is an amazing lens, and they make it for both Sony E-mount as well as L-mount cameras. We set all the lenses at 50 millimeters, our aperture at 2.8, and we put our shutter speed at 1/50th of a second because Sony A7 IV doesn't have shutter angle. And then whatever ISO would properly expose the image. We placed all three cameras in a row at the same height and at the same distance from its subjects. As far as autofocus settings, the Sony A7 IV, we set our autofocus speed to a 5 out of 7 and its sensitivity to 3 out of 5. With the Canon R5C, we put our autofocus speed at 0 out of 2 because 2 is the max, and our sensitivity 1 out of 3. And with the Lumix S5ii, we put our autofocus speed at 3 out of 5 and its sensitivity at 2 out of 5. Now, for the first test, we started by wanting to see its transition behavior, or its sensitivity. How quickly will it transition from one subject to the next? Here we had all three cameras focused on the subjects in the back. We have our Lumix rep Matt and a customer. Then I would randomly pop into frame and let's see which camera grabs focus first. I was able to label when each camera would grab focus in order. And at times it was a little bit difficult because we had to break it down frame by frame. So when I pop into frame, Canon grabs first, followed closely by Sony, and then a second later is Lumix. And I pop back out and I do it again. And again, Canon grabs first, followed closely by Sony, and then Lumix third, about a second later. For the second test, we removed the subjects from the background, and I would pop into frame again. And so let's see what happens. With the empty frame, I pop in, Sony's first, followed closely by Canon, and then Lumix third. And then we do it again. Sony's first, followed by Canon, and then a second later is our Lumix camera. And then we do it again. And this time Sony's first and Lumix is second, and then third is Canon. Sony's first, Canon second, and then Lumix third. And one last time, Sony grabs first, followed closely by Lumix second, and then Canon is third. This third test, I pop into frame at a further distance from the cameras, and I let it follow me. I also make a couple quick movements towards the cameras. Sony's first, followed quickly by Lumix, and then Canon. And then on the other side, I pop into frame and Sony's first, followed quickly by Lumix, and then Canon third. And a couple quick movements towards the camera, and Lumix loses it just for a couple frames. But look how all three stay with me. It's pretty impressive. The next test is similar. I walk into frame some distance away from the cameras and I get to practice my Naruto run. And I get to run towards the camera. Occasionally I would turn my back to see if it would hold the focus and just focus on my body and not the background. I not only wanted to see when each camera would grab focus, but I wanted to see if any of them would lose focus because of my immense speed or from me turning my back. Sony's first, Lumix is second, and Canon is third. Now Lumix lost me just for a couple frames, but it snaps back into focus. And then I turn my back, and all cameras are great, just grabbing the body and focusing on that. And again, Lumix loses it just for a couple frames, but it snaps back into focus. And whether I'm facing the camera or turning my back, it holds the focus, all three cameras. And again, I walk into frame. Sony's first, Lumix is second, and Canon is third. And Lumix lost focus just for a couple frames, and I dash at the camera, and they all hold me. And what's cool here is that all three cameras, they know exactly when to grab focus on the magazine and when to transition to my face. They know what the subject is or what we're trying to capture. I don't know how they do it, but all three cameras know exactly what to focus on. The fifth test, I walk into frame and walk at a normal pace up to the cameras. Nothing special, just a simple walk into frame and walk towards cameras. Sony's first, Canon second, and Lumix is third. And Lumix loses the focus just for a couple frames and then snaps it right back. And then we do it again. Sony's first, followed closely by Canon, and then Lumix third. And again, Lumix loses it just for a couple frames. The next phase of testing, we wanted to see what the mostly finished picture profile would look like, straight out of camera. We set all cameras to auto white balance. So for the Sony A7 IV, we set the picture profile to the S Cinetone, and for the Canon R5C, we put it to the color profile of C1, which is BT709 wide dynamic range. And then for the Lumix S5ii, we did Cinelike D2. What you're looking at are the raw, untouched clips with no correction, no color grade, just straight out of camera. Just take a look at how it looks with my skin tone, as well as my red hoodie. And then for some variation, I threw Lynette in there so you can see how each profile looks. How does it look with my pale face and then compared to someone that has a little bit more pigment in their skin? In my opinion, all of these color profiles look great. You can even make minor tweaks to these with some correction or color grading, and they look fantastic. Finally, we did a log test. All these log profiles are super easy to work with, and they all look pretty flat. In my personal opinion, maybe the Panasonic looks a little bit more flat than the other two. It's hard to determine, but looking at my red hoodie, it seems like the S5ii is just slightly flatter than the others. Even after you correct and color grade these samples, they all look great. You could possibly even interchange them with one another and no one will be able to tell that one is Canon, one is Sony, or one is Lumix. The color science in all these things are amazing. But what about resolution? Even punched in at 400%, can you tell which is which? All these cameras oversample from a higher resolution to 4K, and they do an amazing job. Even if you pixel people like crazy, can you really tell a difference? When it comes to autofocus in the Lumix S5ii, there's three things to keep in mind. The first is that although the S5ii came in third in some of these tests, it was only by a couple frames. I'm talking sometimes 1, 2, or even 3 frames behind the Canon R5C, a camera that is more than double the price tag. Second thing to keep in mind is that there were a couple tests where the S5ii beat the Canon R5C. So it has the capability of doing amazing autofocus. The third thing to keep in mind is that this is a pre-production model. This is not necessarily the model with the current firmware that is going to be released to the consumers. Both Sony and Canon have had years of firmware updates to improve their autofocus and to fine-tune it into something that's truly amazing. So for Panasonic to have a pre-production autofocus that can compete with Sony and Canon for hundreds, if not thousands less, Bravo. I'd say Panasonic is probably a firmware update or two away from sharing a seat with Sony. Cameras in this range, we're talking the Lumix S5 II, the Sony A7 IV, the Canon R6 Mark II, are honestly about compromises. Sony has great dynamic range and autofocus, but its rolling shutter and lack of video features tends to limit it. Canon sacrifices dynamic range and could possibly at times overheat, but has great color science and high resolutions. So entry-level pros had to decide what compromises they were willing to accept. But now we have the Lumix S5 II, a camera that has all the video features, great color science, and great resolutions. So when we talk about value and best bang for your buck, the Lumix S5 II is it. In fact, I ended up pre-ordering the Lumix S5 IIX, and we're looking forward to testing that thing out. To finish up, we want to extend a huge thank you to Unique Photo for letting us utilize their space for the purpose of this test. Now, the staff was super helpful, they were just super down to earth and just nice people. And another huge thank you to Matt Chandler, the Panasonic Lumix rep, for making the trip from Massachusetts to New Jersey. Matt was great in answering questions, not just to us, but quite a few that came in to see the S5 II in action. But now it's your turn. Did this test and comparison turn out the way that you expected or hoped? In fact, which of these cameras do you plan on using and for what type of work? Let us know in the comments below. So, till next time.